Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The corridors of Obiora Group gleamed like a kingdom in bloom. For the first time in years, peace reigned within the walls that once echoed with betrayal and suspicion. Kelvin Obiora walked through the executive wing with calm steps, nodding at familiar faces who greeted him with genuine smiles. Joan, no longer just a maid, now wore neatly tailored blouses and ankle-length skirts, her ID badge pinned just beneath her confident chin. As head of internal integrity and staff welfare, she commanded quiet authority, earning respect even from those who once ignored her. The company had not only survived but was thriving, new partnerships, fresh investors, a loyal customer base. But more than numbers and performance, there was a sense of healing. Staff meetings started on time. Office gossip turned toward positive things. And in the center of it all, Kelvin and Joan worked side by side, building something stronger than legacy, something human. Behind closed doors, however, Kelvin battled a silent storm, one that had nothing to do with finances or sabotage. His heart had long crossed the boundary between professional admiration and something deeper for Joan. He remembered every moment she had fought for him, how she refused to run when things got dangerous, and how her whisper had pulled him back from the edge. Yet, he hadn't said a word. Maybe because he feared ruining the peace. Or maybe because he knew Joan had suffered too much to be burdened with anything else, especially love. So, he buried the feeling under routine. Shared elevator rides, late-night policy reviews, early morning coffee chats. But sometimes he would glance across the boardroom and catch her smiling as she listened to a junior staff's presentation, and his chest would tighten. Still, he said nothing. Joan, on the other hand, was thriving professionally but privately haunted. Though the firm had risen from its ashes, she often dreamed of the night her father pulled her aside and whispered, "Courage has a price, and I pray you're ready to pay it." Her father was still alive then, helping her with her mother's medications, cooking when she worked late, assuring her that loyalty always returns. The last few months had felt almost too perfect, too still, but she chalked it up to exhaustion and the long journey they had survived. She didn't want to be paranoid, didn't want to assume that peace meant plotting. So she walked through the halls of Obiora Group each day with a thankful heart, never knowing that the same quiet floor she polished years ago would soon carry the echo of a threat meant to break her forever. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Joan found the letter. She had returned from a lunch meeting with a small group of female interns, encouraging them to speak up during board sessions, and returned to her office, glowing with quiet pride. As she reached for her notepad to jot down a few new mentorship program ideas, she noticed the corner of a paper poking out beneath the drawer lining. Curious, she pulled it out. There was no envelope, just a folded white sheet of printer paper. The handwriting was oddly neat, slanted, and sharp. "Leave Obiora Group or bury your family. You have 72 hours. No name, no signature, no mistakes. Just the slow-burning terror of knowing someone had bypassed security, accessed her private drawer, and delivered a message that wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Her hands trembled as she read it again. She immediately checked her office door. Locked. She pulled out her phone and called Kelvin. When he answered with his usual warmth, "Joan, everything okay?" She couldn't find words at first. "I need you in my office now. Come alone," she finally said. When he arrived, Joan silently handed him the note. His expression shifted immediately from curious to furious. "This is ridiculous," he said, pacing. "Someone's trying to play mind games. Probably a jealous staff member." But Joan remained frozen, staring at the paper. "Kelvin, this wasn't left on my desk. It was inside my drawer." The silence that followed said more than Kelvin's words ever could. He immediately called for internal security, ordered a full sweep of the floor, and reviewed camera footage. Nothing. No one suspicious. No fingerprints. No record of tampering. Whoever left that letter knew what they were doing. That night, Kelvin escorted Joan home personally. He stayed until past midnight, refusing to leave until her mother and younger siblings were safely asleep. Joan didn't eat. She didn't speak much. She just sat by the window, staring out into the darkness like a soldier expecting war. "This isn't over," she whispered once, more to herself than anyone. Kelvin sat beside her and placed a hand gently over hers. "You're not alone in this," he said softly. "Whoever this is will find them." But deep in his heart, fear grew like vines around his ribs. The Obiora name carried many enemies, and some of those enemies were clever enough to wait for peace before launching the final blow. He promised himself that night he would protect Joan even if it meant war, even if it meant tearing apart the empire he had rebuilt. But neither of them expected how fast the blood would follow. It happened 2 days later. Joan was preparing to leave for a security meeting when her phone rang. The number was private, but her instinct made her answer. The voice on the other end was deep, cold, and without emotion. "Check the open field behind Ajagunal Secondary School. Before sunset." The call ended. Her stomach dropped. She called Kelvin immediately, and within minutes, they were en route with security in tow. Joan said nothing in the car. Her mother had gone to the market. Her siblings were at school. Her father, he had gone out early that morning to fix the leaking roof in their family compound. They found his body before sunset, face down, blood pooling around his skull. On his palm, etched crudely with a knife, "Next is your mother." Joan screamed like a wounded animal. She collapsed beside her father's body, shaking, her cries cutting through the late afternoon silence like thunder. Kelvin couldn't speak, couldn't move. He stood in shock as his staff tried to pull Joan away gently. But she wouldn't let go. "He didn't deserve this," she wailed. "He never hurt anyone. He told me to be strong. He believed in me." Security secured the area, police arrived, and paramedics tried to calm her down. But no one could reach her, not even Kelvin. That night, Joan sat beside her father's body in the morgue, refusing food, refusing warmth. She held his cold hand until her tears stopped falling, because there was nothing left to cry. The cost of loyalty had come in blood, and the silence of the enemy was louder than any scream. Kelvin felt rage unlike anything he had ever known. That night, after ensuring Joan's family was under protection, he called in favors. He tripled her security detail. He launched a secret investigation outside of the company's internal team. But nothing came back. No trace. No warning. No name. The enemy hadn't just struck, they had calculated every move. Joan didn't sleep for days. She refused to go home. She barely ate. The vibrant, hopeful woman who once stood in front of hundreds to defend Kelvin was now a hollow vessel. "He died because of me," she said softly one night. "They warned me, and I didn't listen." Kelvin held her. "No, Joan. He died because they're cowards, and I will make sure you never bury another loved one again." His voice broke, and with that he made the hardest decision of all. He would send her away, even if it meant losing her. The Obiora mansion had never been quieter. After Joan's father was laid to rest in a modest but painful ceremony, Kelvin brought her to stay in the guest wing of his estate, not as a gesture of comfort, but as a shield. She barely spoke, often sitting for hours on the balcony, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for the next tragedy to arrive. Her mother and siblings were now in a secured house under heavy surveillance, thanks to Kelvin's connections with a retired commissioner of police. But Joan hadn't returned home since the burial. Her soul hadn't either. She wore black for days and then stopped changing altogether, moving from room to room like a spirit wandering through unfamiliar corridors. Kelvin visited every day, sometimes sitting in silence beside her, sometimes reading company reports out loud to distract her. But even as he tried to speak of normal things, there was nothing normal left in Joan's world. On the 5th night after the burial, Kelvin found her in the library, curled up near the fireplace. It was the first time she had left her room willingly. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "I shouldn't have stayed. I should have listened. He would still be here." Kelvin sat beside her, unsure how to carry a grief he could barely touch. "You stayed because you believed in something bigger than yourself. That's not weakness, Joan. That's the kind of strength people write books about. She looked at him, and for the first time in days, her eyes met his without fear. "What if my mother is next?" she whispered. "What if my siblings are taken while I sleep?" The fear in her voice shattered him. Kelvin gently held her hand. "You will not lose anyone else. I swear on everything my father left me. I will protect what's left of your family." It was a promise he meant with every ounce of his soul, and it forced a decision he never wanted to make. That same night, he called Clara, his trusted lawyer, and arranged for an urgent relocation for Joan and her family. But Joan refused. "I'm not running, Kelvin," she said through clenched teeth. "I can't bury another father. But I can't leave you either. This company," he cut her off gently, his voice cracking. "I'm not sending you away because I doubt your strength. I'm doing it because I know your worth. Let me carry the weight for now. Just this once." The argument lasted for hours. In the end, Joan gave in, not because she was convinced, but because she saw how scared Kelvin was. That night, he stood outside the plane hangar, watching her walk toward the jet, shoulders heavy, heartbreaking. But what he didn't know was this: Joan had no intention of going anywhere. She had already made arrangements for her family, but she would stay behind in the shadows. While Obiora Group mourned quietly and tried to hold on to stability deep within a high-security prison in Abuja, Gideon Obiora sat comfortably in a private cell that looked nothing like the caged life it was supposed to be. Flat-screen TV, bookshelves, and private phone access were just part of the benefits he had secured through bribery. The guards who once respected Kelvin now bowed before his older brother, not out of fear, but favor. Gideon had spent months building a network inside. He made sure money flowed from silent accounts, and that calls went out from ghost numbers. But now, with Joan grieving and Kelvin alone, the timing was perfect. A corrupt guard handed him a printed report. Foreign merger failed. Obiora stock drops 8%. Gideon smiled like a snake. He poured himself a drink from the cell's smuggled bar and dialed a secure line. "Is the old man in place?" he asked. "He's ready," came the voice on the other end. "He says it's time to burn the rest." The old man was Mr. Obiora Sr., the uncle everyone had forgotten, Nonso's father, the elder brother of Chief Damien Obiora. Years ago, he had been silently pushed out of the company for corruption, but he never forgot. He never forgave. And when his son Nonso was sentenced for crimes committed under Gideon's orders, he saw an opportunity. If Kelvin fell, the Obiora name would crumble, and in the ashes, he would rise as a savior, reclaiming everything that was taken. With Gideon in prison and Nonso disgraced, it was the perfect arrangement. No one would suspect a man outside the company, and no one would imagine that the puppet strings led back to a jail cell. Together, they plotted a new kind of war, not with bombs, but with rumors, bribery, and betrayal. Their first step was subtle. They began bribing lower-level staff at Obiora Group to delay communications, leak internal memos, and misfile confidential contracts. Gideon laughed as he reviewed photos of frustrated clients waiting in lobbies. Headlines accusing Obiora Group of mismanagement. "Death by chaos," he muttered. He orchestrated everything through a network of disposable proxies, untraceable and obedient. Every time an investor pulled out, every time a project failed, it was a needle into Kelvin's heart. But Gideon wanted more. He wanted to see his brother kneel. "Crush the board," he told his uncle. "Turn them against him. Make them doubt everything." Meanwhile, in the outside world, Kelvin struggled to keep the company afloat, unaware that the most dangerous war was happening behind curtains, and the hands holding the weapons were calling from inside a cell. It began with missed emails, then unsigned checks, then an important equipment delivery that mysteriously never arrived, causing a 2-week delay on a 2 billion Nigerian nairas contract. At first, Kelvin assumed it was an internal error. Staff were stretched. The administrative team was overworked. But soon, the frequency of mishaps became impossible to ignore. He called emergency meetings with department heads. No one had answers. "I sent the document," said one manager. "I handed over the proposal," swore another. But the end results told a different story. The Obiora Group that once operated like a fine-tuned machine was now stumbling like a wounded animal. Kelvin felt the noose tightening, not around his neck, but around his credibility. He stayed longer hours, micromanaged emails, oversaw contracts line by line. But no matter how hard he tried, things still fell apart. And the board? They noticed. By the next quarter, the murmurs had begun. Whispers of incompetence. Hints of lost control. He was strong during the crisis. Yes, one board member told another. But maybe he's not a long-term leader. Maybe Joan was the backbone, not him. Kelvin could feel it. The same boardroom where he was once applauded now felt colder. Eyes avoided his. Conversations shifted when he walked in. Clara tried to defend him in private. "You're not the problem, Kelvin. You're the target." But her voice couldn't stop a train already set in motion. The board gave him 30 days to stabilize the company, subtly implying that failure would lead to resignation. It was a polite way of saying, "We've lost faith in you." Kelvin returned to his office that evening and stared at the portrait of his father hanging above his desk. He remembered the man who had built this company brick by brick, not just with vision, but with discipline. "I'm trying, Papa," he whispered. "But the ghosts won't leave." In the quiet of the room, he picked up a pen and began to write again, not a memo or a business plan, but a letter to Joan. He told her everything. The failures, the doubts, the growing silence in the boardroom. But like the others, he never sent it. He placed it in a drawer beside the others. And he sat back in his chair, staring into the shadows, unaware that Joan was closer than ever, watching, planning, waiting to return with thunder. The betrayal didn't come with a knife in the back. It came in the form of a spreadsheet. A single document meant to finalize a high-stakes merger with a European tech company vanished 2 hours before the deadline. Kelvin, exhausted but hopeful, had prepared for weeks. Late nights, phone calls across time zones, presentations revised a dozen times. But when the final file was supposed to be presented, it was missing. Clara checked the backup systems, corrupted. The email chain? Somehow interrupted and manipulated. The IT department said it was a virus. But Kelvin knew better. Something was rotten at the core. The merger collapsed. In under 24 hours, Obiora Group lost a 3.6 billion Nigerian nairas opportunity, and worse, its credibility in the international market. The board held an emergency session without inviting Kelvin, and the whispers turned into demands. The shock hadn't even faded before Kelvin received another hit. Emmanuel Oak, a senior executive and once trusted advisor to both his father and himself, was caught leaking financial projections to rival companies. Clara confronted him, expecting denial. But Emmanuel didn't even blink. "You think you're untouchable, Kelvin? This company needs leadership, not heartbreak stories and loyalty games." His words cut deeper than the betrayal. That night, Kelvin drove home in silence, his hands trembling at the wheel. He couldn't trust his board. He couldn't trust his managers. His house, once filled with Joan's laughter and quiet strength, now echoed with painful silence. He poured himself a drink, but couldn't touch it. Instead, he opened the drawer and added another letter to the growing pile. "Joan, I don't know who's real anymore, but I wish you were here." But Joan was there, just not in the way he expected. Every moment of sabotage, every staff member acting suspicious, she tracked and recorded it. From a small apartment on the outskirts of Abuja, she monitored the company using carefully planted surveillance tools and insider leaks, all coordinated through her planted spy, Nneka, the housemaid she had once worked with. Joan hadn't left Nigeria. She had only pretended to fly out with her family. While they were safe in Ghana under Kelvin's orders, she returned under a false identity. She rented a dusty apartment, wore plain clothes, and used a network of ex-staff to stay hidden. She sent Nneka in as a cleaning recruit, but her real task was intelligence. Every misplaced file, every shady staff payment, it all came back to Joan. And now, as the sabotage intensified and Kelvin began to crack, Joan was readying her storm. From the moment Nneka entered the company under her new alias, she realized Obiora Group was no longer what it used to be. The receptionist barely looked up. Senior staff barked orders without purpose. Files were disorganized, meetings constantly rescheduled, and worst of all, no one noticed. It was as if the soul had been sucked out of the building. But Nneka wasn't just a maid now. She was a spy with direction. Joan had trained her before she entered. Micro-recorder hidden in her name tag, tracking software in her handbag, and the most important tool, a code phrase for reporting. Every day she texted Joan with updates, disguised as harmless maid banter. The fridge leaked today, boss meant a meeting had been secretly shifted. The kitchen's too crowded meant unexpected visitors had arrived. It was an invisible war, and Joan was finally gaining ground. On one particular day, Nneka overheard Emmanuel, the traitorous executive, arguing with an unknown caller in the conference room. "You said Kelvin would be gone already." "The board is hesitating," she whispered from behind the slightly ajar door, recording every word. Later, the audio clip was sent to Joan, who replayed it repeatedly until she recognized the voice on the other end. Nonso's father, the one person everyone assumed had left business years ago. Her hands trembled. It all made sense now. The old man, hiding in plain sight, had been the hand behind the curtain. With his political reach and family name, he had remained clean, while letting his disgraced son and imprisoned nephew take the fall. Joan knew what this meant. This wasn't about Kelvin anymore. It was about revenge, legacy, and old wounds. Back in her apartment, Joan pinned photos, transcripts, financial statements, and call logs to her wall like a detective chasing a serial killer. For days, she barely slept. With the help of a retired cybersecurity analyst who owed her father a favor, Joan began tracing offshore payments that linked back to ghost accounts tied to both Gideon and Nonso's father. It was a web of corruption so intricately woven that anyone outside would have missed it. But not Joan. For every thread she pulled, a knot loosened. But time was running out. Kelvin had just 2 days before his final board meeting, where resignation papers were expected. She couldn't wait any longer. It was time to reveal the truth. But how? The board didn't trust anyone. The staff was compromised. Then it came to her. Show up. Break the silence. Let them see the woman they tried to erase. Kelvin sat in his office, a man unrecognizable even to himself. His beard was unkempt, his suits wrinkled, and the bags beneath his eyes seemed to carry the weight of a dying empire. He stared at the wall where his father's portrait still hung, the same man who had chosen him over Gideon. What would he think of him now? A CEO stripped of authority, a man abandoned by the only woman who had believed in him. He had written her 19 letters, 19 unsent whispers to a woman who had promised never to leave. Was she truly gone? Was she safe? He thought about her every day, the sound of her laugh, the softness of her hands when she wiped his face during the last board scandal. Why did you leave me to drown? He thought. The staff no longer saluted with confidence. Clients barely returned calls, and his office felt colder by the minute. Even Clara had begun subtly distancing herself, not because she stopped believing in him, but because she feared what was coming. The board had made it clear, deliver a turnaround by Friday or step down. Kelvin had nothing left. No trusted allies, no working strategies, no Joan. He stared out the window, watching the Obiora Group compound from above, a place that once buzzed with pride and now reeked of sabotage. He had promised his father to protect this legacy. But now, it seemed his leadership had become the final crack in its foundation. Meanwhile, across the city, Joan was suiting up. Dressed in a clean black corporate gown, minimal makeup, and her natural hair combed back into a bun, she stepped out of her hidden apartment for the first time in weeks. Her phone buzzed. It was Nneka. They're moving fast. Papers are being prepared. Tomorrow is the final meeting. Joan didn't reply. She only stared at herself in the mirror before entering the taxi. She looked nothing like the frightened maid who once whispered warnings to a billionaire. Now she was returning not as a cleaner, not even as a staff member, but as a woman with fireproof truth. She would speak, and this time the world would listen. The morning of the board meeting felt like a funeral. The corridors of Obiora Group were unusually silent, as though the company itself sensed what was coming. Kelvin sat alone in his office, staring at the document that would finalize his resignation. His name printed in bold, followed by an empty space for his signature. That signature meant defeat. It meant letting Gideon and Nonso's father win. But more than that, it meant accepting that his leadership had failed, not because he wasn't capable, but because the system had been rigged long before he even stepped into the CEO's chair. He looked at the empty space across the table, where Joan used to sit, her notepad always filled with meticulous notes. The absence was louder than a scream. He felt like a soldier marching to the guillotine with his head held high, yet his soul already bowed. As he walked into the boardroom, every eye was on him. The board members wore carefully constructed masks of indifference, but some looked almost relieved, as though they had longed for this day. Chairman Dave, a man in his 60s with a well-trimmed gray beard and a voice soaked in calm authority, stood. Kelvin Obiora, it is with respect to your father's legacy that we've tolerated the past few months of instability. But Obiora Group is no longer safe in your hands. The finality in his voice was brutal. No debate. No discussion. Just a passing of judgment. Kelvin slowly rose to respond, but there was nothing left to say. Every department had been poisoned from the inside. Every ally either silenced or too afraid to act. He reached into his folder, brought out his resignation document, and stared at it one last time. Just as he picked up the pen, the door flew open. A sharp gasp echoed through the room. Everyone turned. Standing at the entrance was Joan, calm, composed, and burning with quiet rage. Her black gown hugged her frame with elegance, but it was the fire in her eyes that silenced the room. She walked in without invitation, her heels echoing like a war drum against the tiled floor. "This resignation is a mistake," she said, voice unwavering. "Kelvin Obiora is not your problem. Your problem is rotting in prison and hiding in mansions, smiling as you self-destruct." The board looked at each other in confusion, some murmuring. Chairman Dave blinked. "Who are you to speak at this meeting?" Joan locked eyes with him. "I'm the one who didn't leave. The one who fought from the shadows while your own staff danced for traitors." She turned to Kelvin, who was frozen with shock, his eyes welling. He had seen miracles. But this was resurrection. The silence in the boardroom cracked under the weight of Joan's words. Kelvin slowly lowered the pen, unable to process what was unfolding. Joan walked forward, pulling out a brown envelope from her handbag. "Inside here are financial records of staff members receiving bribes traced to shell accounts registered under the alias Barista Industrial Ltd. She paused, then added with chilling calm, "That company is owned by Nonso's father, hidden under his cousin's name in Togo. The same cousin who died 5 years ago." She laid out screenshots of transactions, printouts of staff statements, voice recordings transcribed line by line. "All of it," she said. "Every deal sabotaged, every document erased, every lie told to ruin this company, paid for with blood money and managed by staff you thought loyal." The room was dead quiet. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. Others glanced at each other in disbelief. Joan then tapped her phone. A recording began to play, a conversation between Emmanuel and Nonso's father, discussing the planned smear campaign against Kelvin. Then another clip. A corrupt security officer at the prison reading messages sent by Gideon, directing bribes and chaos from behind bars. "These are the men you thought defeated," she said bitterly. "But while you held meetings and pointed fingers, they were turning you into puppets." Clara, the once distant assistant, gasped and covered her mouth. Chairman Dave stood. This cannot be real." But Joan wasn't done. She stepped aside as the door opened again, and Neka walked in, dressed no longer as a maid, but as a witness. She carried files, photos, and a signed statement. "I was their maid," she said softly. "But I saw everything. They used this company like a faucet, turning off success and pouring in poison." The next hour unfolded like a courtroom drama. Joan laid out a full presentation, weeks of evidence collected in silence. Staff members were named, call logs displayed, surveillance footage shown. She even revealed the chain of deleted files and backdoors used to access Kelvin's private office network. Slowly, The cold expressions on the board members' faces began to crumble. What had once been blind certainty shifted into shame, horror, and fury. Clara burst into tears. One of the senior managers tried to leave the room, only to be stopped by police officers waiting outside. Joan had coordinated with the EFCC, and as more names were read aloud, they entered, began making arrests. Chairman Dave, wide-eyed, turned to Kelvin. We were wrong." Kelvin didn't answer. His eyes were still locked on Joan. For the first time in months, he saw the company's heart beating again, and it wasn't from him. It was from her. Nneka stood tall before the stunned board members, her eyes betraying the exhaustion of weeks spent pretending, hiding, and recording. "I was recruited as a cleaner," she began, "but I was trained to trace digital footprints. I planted trackers on workstations. I logged unauthorized entries. I recorded confessions hidden behind innocent conversations." She opened a flash drive, and the projector displayed more damning data. Internal network breach maps, timestamps of altered documents, and leaked security codes. They made Kelvin look weak, but all he ever did was try to protect what his father built. Her voice trembled at the end, and Joan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Nneka. You've done enough." Joan then turned to Kelvin and whispered, "It's not over, but it's beginning to end." Outside, the EFCC raided Gideon's prison cell, finding burner phones, handwritten letters, smuggled SIM cards, and 2 guards who had been receiving regular transfers. The footage reached the news that same night. Meanwhile, at the palatial estate of Nonso's father, EFCC trucks pulled up as he sat sipping tea with 2 ministers. His confident smile evaporated when he saw the arrest warrant. "You have no idea who I am," he screamed. But the world knew now. His mansion was searched, secret accounts uncovered, offshore shell companies traced. His arrest shook the business world, and for the first time in decades, Obiora Group's board issued a public apology to its staff and shareholders. Kelvin, reinstated by unanimous vote, refused to speak at the press conference. Instead, he issued one sentence through Clara. The true guardian of this company wore no title. Later that night, back at headquarters, Kelvin found Joan on the rooftop, looking out over the glowing city. He walked to her in silence, then wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I thought you were gone," he whispered. She didn't turn. "I had to stay," she replied, "because even if you were ready to give up, I wasn't." Tears slipped down Kelvin's face. "You saved me. You saved this company." Joan finally turned, resting her forehead against his. "No," she said. "We saved each other." Beneath them, Obiora Group, the company nearly lost to betrayal and silence, pulsed with life again. The exposure of Gideon and Nonso's father ignited storm across the corporate world. What began as whispers inside Obiora Group erupted into national headlines. Television stations ran the news with scrolling banners. Former CEO's brother and uncle implicated in multi-billion naira corporate sabotage. Social media exploded. Shareholders demanded answers. Sponsors pulled out of every company remotely linked to the Obiora family. In a dramatic turn, video footage of Joan's boardroom confrontation leaked online. Millions watched her walk in fearless, exposing the rot. She became a symbol, not just of resilience, but of a quiet strength the country rarely honored. Meanwhile, the EFCC continued sweeping operations. They uncovered shell companies owned by Nonso's father across Nigeria, Ghana, and Dubai. Funds siphoned from Obiora Group had financed real estate purchases, political bribes, and luxury items stacked in safe houses. It was treason dressed in linen suits and gold watches. In Gideon's prison cell, silence had replaced arrogance. The cell that once echoed with quiet confidence now bore marks of desperation. One of the guards had cracked under interrogation and confessed to the entire scheme. He revealed the coded system through which Gideon sent out orders. Every Thursday, bribes were packed in meal trays. If a tomato was missing, it meant yes. If it came with extra pepper, it meant no. Gideon never wrote anything directly. He whispered commands to a middleman who had been posing as a fellow inmate. When the EFCC raided again, they found a journal hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. each verse marked with letters from names of staff Kelvin once trusted. Your son rots from within, Gideon once bragged to their father's portrait, according to a note scribbled in the margins. But the walls were closing in now. His ego could no longer protect him from the consequences he had summoned with his envy. Nonso's father, Mr. Clement Obiora, tried to manipulate his way out. He pulled every string, calling in favors from judges, senators, and even international partners. But the net had tightened too far. The FCC had recordings of calls between him and imprisoned Gideon. They had receipts of bribes, handwritten letters, and screenshots from conversations detailing which departments to attack and which people to target. What made matters worse was a voice note found in NECA's recordings, Mr. Clement telling his accomplices, "Joan is only a maid. She won't survive this. Take her father if she won't listen." That note was played publicly during the first hearing. The court fell into dead silence. The judge's voice cracked when he called it the most inhumane form of corporate warfare I have ever witnessed. As Gideon, Nonso, and Clement sat on the bench awaiting final sentencing, the world watched them, not as businessmen, but as traitors. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity on the day of sentencing. Reporters, company executives, legal interns, and even former Obiora staff gathered to witness justice. Gideon looked pale, his once proud demeanor replaced by a shadow of regret. Nonso refused to look at Joan. His father, Mr. Clement, wore a gray bata and a forced smirk, the only one still clinging to pride. Joan sat in the front row, her eyes red but defiant. Kelvin held her hand tightly. The judge entered. His robes billowed behind him like thunderclouds. "This court," he began, "has reviewed the extensive evidence brought forward by the EFCC, witness testimonies, forensic audits, and electronic data tracing. What we have seen is not only a betrayal of corporate trust, but a calculated war against integrity." He adjusted his glasses, then turned to the accused. "Gideon Obiora, for orchestrating corporate sabotage and conspiracy from prison, your initial sentence is hereby extended by 15 years without parole." Gasps rippled through the room. Gideon's jaw tightened. The gavel struck once. "Nonso Obiora, for active involvement, manipulation, and strategic laundering of company secrets. Your sentence is increased to 12 years. Nonso slumped in his seat. Then came the blow. "Mr. Clement Obiora, for being the principal architect of this fraud, financing the murder of Mr. Eek, Joan's father, illegal offshore transactions, and the abuse of a trusted position. This court finds you guilty on all counts. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Screams echoed. Clement stood up violently. "This is injustice. I built Obiora with my own hands," he shouted. The judge responded coldly. "You built nothing. You destroyed a legacy your brother entrusted to the wrong men." Security dragged him out as flashes from cameras captured his final breakdown. Justice wasn't just served, it was branded into history. Outside the courtroom, Kelvin and Joan stood quietly as reporters bombarded them. "Do you feel vindicated? Ms. Joan, you were once a maid. Did you ever imagine this moment?" "Mr. Kelvin, what happens to Obiora Group now?" Kelvin stepped forward. His voice was soft, firm, and without pride. "Obiora Group didn't survive because of me," he said. "It survived because of a woman who refused to run. A woman who wept quietly but fought loudly when it mattered." Then he turned to Joan. "She is not just the whisper that warned me. She is the roar that saved us all." The crowd went silent, then erupted into applause. For the first time, Joan smiled, not in victory, but in relief. Her father would never come back. The wounds would never fully heal. But justice had been spoken. Not in noise. Not in noise, but in truth. That night, the city glowed with headlines, flashing lights, and victory celebrations. But inside Kelvin's mansion, it was quiet. Joan sat on the rooftop garden wrapped in a shawl, watching the moon rise. The battle was over, but the cost had been severe. Her father's laughter would never return. His death had been a message, and it had nearly broken her. The pressure of staying hidden, of pretending to be gone while carrying the weight of an entire company's future on her shoulders, had aged her in months. Kelvin approached, silently placing a cup of ginger tea beside her. "They'll talk about what you did for years," he whispered. Joan nodded. "Let them. I did it for one reason only. Because I knew you were worth saving." Her voice cracked. "And because I promised my father that I would never run from what's right." Kelvin took her hand and kissed it. "You lost your father because of me," he said. "No," she interrupted. "I lost my father because of evil men who feared the light. But you, Kelvin, you gave me the power to fight back. You never silenced me when I spoke. Even when the world doubted you, you listened to a maid." Tears welled up in his eyes. "You were never a maid, Joan. Not to me. You were always my anchor, my light, my reason to try again." He paused. "There were nights I slept in my office not because I was working, but because your absence made the house unbearable." She moved closer, resting her head against his chest. "I never left," she whispered. "I just became invisible so I could protect what mattered." At dawn, Kelvin and Joan stood hand in hand at Obiora Group's headquarters. The staff gathered outside in what became an impromptu company-wide moment of reflection. Kelvin addressed them briefly. "We've been through fire, and we're still standing. Because some people don't need titles to lead. They just need a heart that doesn't give up." Then he turned to Joan. "And this company's heart never stopped beating, because she was always here." The staff applauded, some wiping away tears. As they re-entered the building, a gold plaque was being mounted near the boardroom. "Integrity never whispers forever. Sometimes it roars." And under it, in small letters, "In honor of Joan Eek, whose voice saved us all." In the weeks following the sentencing, Obiora Group resembled a city slowly coming back to life after a war. Broken departments began functioning again, but cautiously, like children who had been hurt too many times. The staff walked through the corridors with relief and quiet reverence, knowing their company had barely survived being destroyed from the inside. Kelvin returned to his office, the one he had nearly vacated forever, and found stacks of files, messages, and resignation letters. Yet amid the chaos, there was a new spirit in the air. Joan was there too, moving between departments with quiet precision, helping reorganize structures, auditing departments, and reinstating trust. But behind her strong steps was a heart still grieving. Sometimes she would pause in front of a closed door, as if expecting her father to walk through it, only to remember that he never would again. Kelvin tried to be strong in front of his team, but the cost of the past few months was written all over his face. He had grown thinner, the circles under his eyes deeper, his once cheerful laughter now a thoughtful silence. At night, he sat alone in his office, watching recordings from the security cameras of the day Joan walked into the boardroom to save him. He would watch her shake with anger and passion as she revealed the truth. A woman who had once been hired to scrub the very tiles she now stood on, daring to stop an empire from falling. He had never felt more love or shame. Love, because her courage saved everything. Shame, because he had doubted that anyone would come back for him. When the lights in the building went off at night, he often whispered to the empty air, "Thank you, Joan, for choosing me over fear." And Joan, as strong as she had been, was slowly breaking from the inside. Her nights were filled with dreams of her father's laughter, then screams. She often went to his grave alone and sat in silence, holding the last letter he had written her, one she never got to read before his death. "You are always the light of my life, Joan," it read. "And no matter where you go, never dim it to please darkness." Those words became her prayer. She hung them on a frame beside her bed. She carried them in her spirit as she returned to work each day, rebuilding a legacy her enemies thought she couldn't defend. But now, as the dust settled, both Joan and Kelvin stood as survivors, not just of corporate war, but of personal ruin. They were scarred, but alive. And love, like a flower in dry ground, was quietly blooming again. It was the Obiora Group's first general staff meeting since the downfall. The staff gathered in the company's hall, not for a presentation or restructuring, but for recognition. The company had survived. New investors were interested. The rebuilding was not just physical, but emotional. When Kelvin walked in, everyone stood. He wasn't just a CEO now, he was a man who had bled for the company, who had survived betrayal, and who had been abandoned by many, but not by her. As he stepped onto the small platform at the front, his eyes found Joan's among the crowd. She stood at the side in a modest gown, her hair tied back, looking at him not as a man of power, but as a man she had fought beside. The applause died down as Kelvin raised the mic, his voice soft but unwavering. "Obiora Group," he began, "is not standing because of my strength. It is standing because someone refused to let it fall. I was ready to resign. I had given up." And then she walked in. His voice cracked. She walked in and reminded every one of us that truth doesn't whisper forever. Sometimes it roars. The staff turned their gaze toward Joan, whose eyes were already filled with tears. "She was once a maid here," Kelvin continued. "You passed her in the corridors. Some ignored her. Some mocked her. But she saw what none of us could see, that our enemy wore our uniforms, and that our strength had been buried under fear. She brought it back." As he looked at her, his voice dropped to a whisper. "Joan, Eek, you didn't just protect this company. You protected me. And for that, you have my eternal respect." The applause that followed shook the walls. Joan tried to hold back her tears, but the moment was too overwhelming. She never fought for recognition. She never fought to be known. But standing there, being seen by every soul that once overlooked her, she realized this wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for every silent fighter who had been told they were too small to matter. That night, she sat in her small apartment surrounded by flowers sent from all departments, cards that read, "Thank you for saving us," and the whisper we never heard until it shouted. But none of them compared to the small velvet box Kelvin left on her desk that morning. Inside was not a ring, but a locket engraved with the words, "The heart that stayed." Joan held it close to her chest and cried, not out of pain, but for the first time, out of peace. A week later, under the moonlight, by the private garden behind Obiora Mansion, Kelvin waited. He stood nervously in a gray kaftan, fingers fidgeting with the small box in his hand. Joan arrived in a flowing white dress, unaware of what was to come. The lanterns flickered around them, soft music playing in the distance. "You look nervous," Joan teased, sitting beside him on the stone bench. He chuckled. "Doi." She nodded. "That's rare." He was silent for a while, then turned to her. "Joan, you changed everything. You were never just the maid. You were the one who stayed when even blood didn't. And now, I can't imagine building anything, Obiora, life, legacy, without you by my side." Her breath caught. Slowly, he knelt before her, the small box in his palm. "I don't just want you beside me at work. I want you beside me in life. Will you marry me?" Joan's hands flew to her mouth as tears flooded her eyes. All the pain, all the suffering, all the betrayal, they flashed before her in that moment. Not because they defined her, but because they led her here. She nodded, unable to speak, then whispered, "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Kelvin rose and wrapped his arms around her, burying his face into her neck as they both wept. It was not a loud celebration, no paparazzi, no fireworks. It was the quiet moment between two people who had survived hell, found each other, and decided to rebuild. The garden bore witness to a love not born in fairy tales, but forged in fire. News of their engagement shocked the media. The maid who once cleaned Obiora's windows was now the future wife of the CEO. Gossip columns called it the Cinderella twist of the year. But to those who truly knew them, to the staff who had seen Joan cry silently in corridors, to the people who watched her defy death and betrayal, it was not a twist. It was justice. Joan was not being elevated. She was simply being seen. And love, true love, wears no title. It simply recognizes home when it finds it. The wedding was not publicized. It didn't happen in a hotel, cathedral, or glamorous beachside location. It was a quiet, dignified ceremony held in the Obiora family compound, the very place where Joan once scrubbed floors and dodged the sneers of high-ranking guests. Now, she walked through the same gates as a bride. The household staff stood in awe as she passed, adorned in an elegant ivory lace gown, her hair pulled back simply, her presence radiating quiet power. She didn't walk with arrogance, she walked with peace. Kelvin stood waiting in a modest, traditional white kaftan, his eyes fixed on her, as if he were seeing a miracle unfold. He knew what it cost her to stand here, all the grief, the betrayal, the sacrifices. She had buried her father, endured separation from her family, and faced threats that would have broken anyone else. But she didn't just survive, she emerged stronger. Mama Esther, the retired matron who once taught Joan how to hold a tray properly as a new maid, was among the few invited. She wept silently during the vows. "Now this same girl way day clean the back corridor every morning," she whispered to another maid. "God really day see person heart." The entire Obiora compound felt the shift, not just in power, but in atmosphere. Gone were the days when the mighty stood unchecked. With Joan now legally part of the Obiora family, things would never be the same again. During the small reception, board members who once doubted her came forward one by one to congratulate her, not out of formality, but out of reverence. They had watched her tear down a cartel of deceit with intelligence, patience, and unshakable loyalty. Joan had become more than a woman. She had become a symbol. That night, Kelvin and Joan didn't speak much. They sat under the same stars, where they once stood broken and exhausted. "I don't deserve you," Kelvin said, holding her hand. "You never left, even when you were told to run." Joan leaned her head on his shoulder and replied, "We don't always choose where we start, but we get to choose where we stand." And that was it. No dramatic speeches, no media interviews, no need to prove anything. Joan had nothing to prove anymore. Her title wasn't what made her powerful. It was the journey that earned it. From maid to madam, she had crossed oceans of pain and emerged not just as a survivor, but as a queen in her own right. Years passed, and Obiora Group rose to heights even its founder never dreamed of. Under Kelvin's visionary leadership and Joan's ironclad internal oversight, the company was recognized as one of Africa's most ethical and resilient corporations. International branches opened. Young girls across the country looked up to Joan, whose story had now become legend. She once mopped the marble floors she now owns, one business journalist said during a feature story titled, "The Woman Who Whispers No More." But Joan didn't let the fame alter her. She kept her original staff ID card on her desk, framed beside a photo of her father. It reminded her of where she came from and why she fought so hard. Every year, the company held a closed-door seminar for new interns. Instead of the HR manager or Kelvin himself, it was Joan who addressed them. She never gave a glamorous speech. Instead, she told them stories of the floors she once scrubbed, of the letter that warned her to run, and of the pain of burying her father. Her voice never wavered, but her eyes always misted. "Don't wait until someone gives you a title," she told them. "Earn it with your heart, your loyalty, and your refusal to quit." The young interns always left in tears, not out of pity, but inspiration. Joan had become living proof that beginnings never define endings. On the company's 10-year anniversary after the sabotage, Kelvin stood before a crowd of new hires, international investors, and longtime employees. Joan stood beside him in a navy blue gown, not as an accessory, but as the soul of the empire. "There was once a whisper in these halls," Kelvin began. "A whisper no one paid attention to. But that whisper saved this company. That whisper stood up when no one else did. That whisper is now my wife. And if a whisper can save an empire, imagine what it can build." The crowd stood, applauding Joan, many with tears in their eyes. And as she looked at her husband, the building, and the faces watching her, she whispered again, this time to herself, "I am still the maid. But now I mop up corruption, not floors." Joan and Kelvin walked off stage together, not just as CEO and assistant executive, not just as husband and wife, but as two warriors who had survived fire, betrayal, and death, and used the ashes to build something that would be whispered about for generations. And this time, the whisper was no longer a warning, it was a legacy. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.